Okay, this is the video on how to launch and run a successful podcast. And I started my podcast a couple of months ago and I learned a lot. So I wanted to share in detail what needs to happen to make it successful and some of the steps that you guys can follow, not only gear, but also the concept, type of guests, the format, the promotion, and what can you do with that in terms of your vision. And yeah, so this is going to be like a depth video on podcasts. I did a quick solo podcast on what gear do I use, but this is going to be more in depth. What do you need to do? How do you launch it? What really matters? So let's dive into it. The very first thing that I will tell you about coming up with a podcast. And before that, the quick story is, when I started my podcast, I wanted to create value for people in terms of the tactical suggestions for their personal growth. And whenever I'm obsessed with learning and growing as fast as possible every single day, so that included me reading a lot of business books, reading a lot of personal development content, and I was also super interested in mindset. And so the goal of the podcast was to, let me go and meet guests, have conversations with them, ask them questions, and then so that my listeners can get something out of it, and then I can also build my personal brand this way. And so today I have 24 episodes, I think. I have another 2 that I will be releasing early next week, which is exciting, and I have a few more already scheduled. And so the goal was to create it to do a podcast in a way that Seeking Wisdom is done from Drift. If you have listened to Seeking Wisdom, Drift is essentially a chatbot company from Boston, and they have a Seeking Wisdom podcast. I think they started it 3 years ago, maybe 3.5 years ago. And I listened a lot to that. I listened to other podcasts, and I've just seen how amazing Seeking Wisdom was, how I liked it. So I wanted to create something similar here in Toronto, but from my personal brand. So right now, the first thing that I will say that is important to have a successful podcast is to come up with the concept, right? And when I say the concept, it could be things like, when we talk about Seeking Wisdom, it's very much unscripted, conversational type of podcast and it doesn't have a lot of guests. Right, so it's basically just David Cancel, the CEO of Drift, and Dave Gerhardt, who's a VP of marketing. That's what usually they do. They usually talk every single time, and then sometimes they have guests. And it's very conversational, not scripted, and amazing value, phenomenal insights they share. That's one way to do it. Another way is more templated and scripted type of podcast with a lot more editing. Like Masters of Scale from Reid Hoffman. So, and you could find a lot of podcasts like that. I personally am not a fan of a podcast style like Masters of Scale. I don't like when people script things and when it's very much, there's a lot of heavy editing. I like to hear just people just conversations where it's more intimate, where it's less scripted, whereas there's a lot less promotion going on and ads. So I don't quite like that. I would say with Seeking Wisdom, with the way that they do it is they don't have a lot of guest interviews, and my podcast has a lot of guest interviews because I don't have another person that I would be doing a lot of episodes with that will contribute a tremendous amount of value, like the CEO of Drift. So I have to find guests, and the format is a bit different, but the theme is similar. The difference in when you are doing it with guests is that it's harder because you don't know the person. It's harder to harder to know them well because sometimes you just don't have enough research online, and then you don't sometimes know how good they are on audio, right? So it's easier to do it with the people who know each other and do it over a longer period of time. You get to a certain state of flow, and it just sounds so amazing. Like for example, there's a podcast called Exponent. I believe it's called Exponent. There's a blog run by Ben Thompson. It's called stratechery.com, and I think they run a podcast called Exponent, and they do it Ben and his friend, and they do it like for a super long time, and it's really great to listen to. It's very conversational. It's not a lot of advertising, and it's a very unscripted. So I really enjoy those. So what is important for when you are coming up with a concept? Well, you want to ask yourself, do you want to interview people or do a solo podcast or do it with another person without guest podcasts? So these are like a fundamental questions that you want to answer, and you obviously can experiment a little bit, but not too much when you start promoting it, because you don't want to be changing your concept too much. And solo podcast is hard. I can tell you, I did, I think 5 episodes. Yeah, I did 5, and I will be doing a lot more, but it's hard sometimes to talk and sound engaging and exciting, but I love talking. And so for me, it was a very easy choice. So solos is hard. With interviewing people, it's also not easy because you want to sound engaging, you want to have energy with people and make sure that they talk and then they enjoy the experience, and then they translate that energy into the listeners, right? So listeners can feel that. So really important for you to consider what kind of format you'd like to go with. Another part is what kind of topics would you be talking about? And this was hard because, like, for example, for my podcast, there's no specific line. I don't just talk about business. I don't just talk about marketing. I don't just talk about personal growth. It's pretty broad range. And the reason it's broad range is because it's growth, right? And growth could be, like, for example, if you're in sales, it doesn't mean that you won't want to know about marketing because you want to get better, or you would not want to know about business because you want to learn more and you want to get better. So, and again, for personal growth, right? You want to know how to be more effective in the morning, how to manage your thoughts better, how to manage your time better. And so there's a blurry line in between different segments, but they all are under a theme of personal and business growth. They will be contributing to those 2 categories. So for me, the criteria of the content and the criteria for the guests that I bring in is that they have to have certain things that will contribute to my listeners' growth on a personal or on a business level. So you want to think about that, and also when you do the research about what kind of podcast you'd like to create, like, see, is there a lot of content already created on that? And so maybe it makes sense to create a slightly different angle in terms of how you're going to be, what kind of content you will be coming up with, right? Maybe it will be personal and business growth for, like, personal growth for marketers, right? Just for marketers, personal growth for marketing. That's kind of interesting. It's a very niche type of a podcast right away. Like, your audience is going to be super niche, and it's going to be exciting because you're going to be talking to marketers, possibly, right? Interviewing marketers, but you will be talking about their personal growth, what books to read, how do they manage their time, how do they prioritize whatever, right? But it won't talk necessarily much about maybe marketing tactics, right? So maybe you're not going to be mentioning the best times to post, the tools to use, and those types of things. And that is a very different concept that can have a lot of people interested. So you want to consider that. Okay, what else? Yeah, so another one is, how comfortable are you with those topics? The reason I'm bringing this up is, how comfortable are you with those topics, is because there's a way where, when you talk to when you're interviewing, and let's say you're going to be interviewing a guest, there's a difference in dynamic if you know about those topics. So you could just do back and forth and it will be conversational. If you don't know much about that, it will be very much like an interview style, where you will be just asking a question, getting an answer, jumping into another question, jumping into another question. So it just sounds better, for me personally, when it's a conversation. But it's totally cool if you are just asking questions and if you're not an expert. Look, that's fine. You can start there and you will build up your expertise later on. And again, if you're working for a company, and if you're, if you're manufacturing plant, then sure, you might not know everything about how those things are manufactured. Then you can just start with interviews. Maybe you will learn more about that, or you can just keep it as an interview format. That still is effective, but conversations are generally more engaging. Okay, so another one is, excuse me, how are you going to get podcast guests? Because getting podcast guests is probably easier if you're doing it for the company and you're doing it with a company. But if you're doing it by yourself, like I'm doing it, it's not easy. So I almost say it as it's almost like sourcing, right? It's almost like prospecting. I have to find people, then convince them they have to get on the podcast, tell them, hey, I have quite a lot of listeners now and I'm getting this X amount of listens per day. And these are the type of guests I had already who are pretty big. So you want to consider that and just think about the strategy you're going to be getting your guests. Like for me, I usually find people on LinkedIn, I send emails, and I also get a lot of referrals. So I would get a referral from somebody. I used to have Facebook groups for a podcast, but sometimes the guests are not quite well aligned with the type of podcast and the value that they can bring. So also important to consider how, if you are just doing guests, right? If you're doing guests and if you're having a frequency of a podcast of one per week, you will need to be putting in a lot of requests to fill up your pipeline to make sure you're able to put consistent amount of episodes and make sure that there are no gaps, because those are really important. So these are all related to coming up with the concept. Point number one, coming up with the concept for the podcast. Okay, so point number two is gear. And gear, I will just briefly mention what I use, and then you can, if you want to know in more detail and how exactly I record, you can go back and listen to the solo episode number 5 of my podcast, the type of gear I use. I explain it in more detail, but essentially what I don't think you have to overthink the gear, to be honest. And this is, I think, the most important parts is that I would say focus on the quality of the content and quality of guests before you get the gear. Because gear, I started recording my podcast with $30 microphones, the lavalier microphones that are 2 microphones that were splitted from 3.5 millimeter jack connection, and then I used my Chinese phone, the cheap Xiaomi Pocophone, which is like the cheapest phone. And it worked. It wasn't amazing. The quality wasn't really that amazing, but that's what I started with. And you could even listen to the episode number 1, number 2. It is a decent quality for $30. But the quality of the content is more important. So I would consider that. The gear I use right now is Zoom. And Zoom is one of the manufacturers that you'll come across if you're doing podcasts. So I use Zoom H5, and then I also use microphones, 2 handheld Shure SM58s, which is a standard mic. It's about $120 Canadian, which is like brings it to about $90, $95 US. So it's not too expensive. It's good. It's a really high quality, really great mic. So I connect them to Zoom H5. H5 is pretty expensive. It's $440 Canadian and $390 or $380 US, I think. That's something around that. But though this is like a really high quality gear that you could get later. And then I process my files with Adobe Audition. Adobe Audition is a really cool software, very easy to use, but you can also even use like simple free tools like QuickTime, Apple QuickTime, even you can cut your audio like that, or you can just outsource it on Fiverr or Upwork to mix the audio. I did it all myself. I found the free audio and then I mixed it with Adobe Audition. I had experience doing that before, so it wasn't that hard. But again, you can outsource it. I wouldn't really get caught up on the gear. That's not as important, but focus on the quality of guests. I wouldn't really compromise that. And even sometimes, because when you're starting, you can get a bit inconsistent with how often your episodes come out. Say you're doing an episode a week. Maybe you just don't have enough time, and or maybe you just missed something and you just skip that episode. That's not the best, but I would say just figure this thing out and then still go for the quality. If you can't find enough quality guests, I would not compromise that. I would just do a solo episode, or I would just not do it. But I wouldn't really plug in another person who's just not the best, who's not a fit. I wouldn't recommend that. Another point, number 4, is iTunes reviews. iTunes reviews are extremely important, and that's really the only place you can leave reviews for a podcast. And the reason for that is because Apple owns like 90% or 85% of all plays on in the world of podcasts. So like you have this directories for podcasts, listen directories, which would be iTunes, Google Play, Stitcher. You have Spotify. You have there's a few more, I think, Player FM, I think there's a few more. And so you have those directories, and out of those directories, and the reason they're called directories is because the files are not hosted there. They are just using your RSS feed from the hosting platform, and then that's how they list it. So, and I will mention a few words about hosting, but iTunes accounts for like 85-90%, and they are the only platform that allows reviews. So the reviews on iTunes are really important because they allow your podcast to go up in the charts and more people are able to discover that. So it's almost like an SEO for Google. That's how I would think about that. So you would want to come up with at least 5-10 reviews or 8 reviews if you can, as soon as possible, ideally right after your podcast launches, so it can go into the new and noteworthy category in iTunes. Because if that happens, that means a lot of people will discover it. You'll be able to get a lot of subscribers. But again, don't forget the quality of the content. That's the super important part. So I would focus a lot on iTunes reviews. In terms of promoting, point number 5, promoting. So the way that I promote my podcast is I release it on LinkedIn. I release it on Instagram, Facebook. I'm adding it to my email list, which I just launched as email list, which is very much more personalized communication with my audience. And then I would say the guest audience is super important, because when you're posting your podcast on your LinkedIn and then you're tagging your guest, a lot of people in your guest category will go into a podcast. If they like the content, if you like your style, they will subscribe. So you can get a really good bump in a number of subscribers by just having a really cool guest on the podcast. That could be a part of your growth strategy, right? In terms of what you can do to promote a podcast, there's a lot of things you can, but these are the most important ones in my opinion. You talk behind the scenes of the podcast. What was the behind the scenes? Because a lot of times you meet a guest, as you do back and forth a little bit, you talk before you start a podcast. You can record a few short videos, put them on LinkedIn, put them on Instagram, and record it as a teaser. Put it as a teaser, and that works extremely well because it's a different setting. You're in their office, or you're in the library, in Starbucks, in wherever you were recording this thing, right? Then people want to see that, and it also gets advantage of guest audience. So and then the same way you can tease your big announcements. If you have a big announcement, if you have a big guest, you can come up with an artwork or do a short video, post it on Instagram or LinkedIn, or put it on an email list. If you have an email list or newsletter, just say PS. We just started this podcast. Here's what we're talking about, and we will have this cool guest that brings whatever to whatever topic you're posting on, like to market theme, right? So that's what I would recommend. And then another one is leverage influencer marketing. I haven't done it a ton, but I would say this could be real effective if you can find people on Instagram, on LinkedIn who would be aligned with your theme. For me, that would be people who are super into personal growth. Connect with them, and then figure out a way to pay them or to give something to them so that they can post about your podcast, promote to their audience, and then you can get more out of get more exposure, get more subscribers, get more comments and likes. And that is a really effective way to promote it. I haven't done it a ton because I need to prioritize. I'm just one person, but I will be doing more of that in the future. Okay, so point number 6. Point number 6 is simple. When you are creating a podcast, you are creating a long piece of content, right? So you can transcribe it, and you can take this transcription and create blogs from it, or you could put it. Or what you can do is that I've seen how people are doing it. If you are recording your podcast and you're doing a video, and I will be doing video later on, I think it's an amazing way to connect with the audience. I don't quite have a lot of times an opportunity to record the video just because depending on the location where I'm at. but video would be very cool. And so you would create a post, you would have your video with the podcast, and you would have a transcription of your podcast below. That is really very, very cool post. And you can also include your video in your email list. Say, hey, this is a new episode, check this thing out. But the purpose of transcription is not only to get the whole thing and just create blogs or shorter pieces of blogs, right? It's also to come up with maybe short bits of audio from your podcast and then cut it and put it on YouTube or put it on Twitter with SoundCloud. You can do that. Or you can come up with quotes. This is real effective, and this is a really simple way that I think is very cool. You come up with a quote, or you don't even have to transcribe this whole thing. You can basically come up with a few quotes and then put it in artwork and then just post it on your social media channels and then link it back to the podcast. So you do it a few times so people who missed it, they can grab it and then re-listen to that, right? What else? Let's see. Yeah, so I would say video is, again, I would say video will be very, very effective. Just requires getting the camera. You can still do it with the iPhone. I haven't done it a ton. My phone is not the best. Again, I have a Chinese phone. I'm waiting for the Google Pixel 4. So that at that point, that will be amazing, but I could still use my Fuji camera, the one I'm recording with this video. But I'd say that would be really, really effective. People like video and audio. This is where we go in generally. But again, just don't underestimate block content. When I was transcribing podcasts into blogs, I was able to get like 8, maybe like 9 even blogs from blog posts from one really good, one solid podcast episode. So you can get a lot, and the duration on that was about like 55 minutes, so it was pretty long. So this is an effective way. Number 7, I already mentioned, it's about guests. So guest sourcing, just figuring this out, really important. And then the last point is, what's your vision? What's the vision for the podcast? And that comes down to, like, where would you like to take it? How many episodes would you like to make? What is the goal for the podcast? And are you really good at this, right? Because like for me, when I started, I knew, and it was very easy for me to choose because I'm very good on audio and video, and I love it and I enjoy it. I know I'm going to be improving a lot. I'm not as excited about writing something. I can write and write well, but I'm just not as excited about it. So for you, it will be important to figure out, like, are you good at interviewing? If you're not, are you willing to put in a lot of hours to improve, because that takes a lot of time and practice? And if you are, amazing, then just go for it. But just that self-awareness part is super important, because it does get pretty hard. You get guests who are not easy to interview. They are sometimes hard to just guide or channel them in the right way, depending on the type of questions you have, or depending on how long they would go. They would go on answering a specific question. So I would consider that. But this is pretty much it. This is pretty much what you will need to launch a successful podcast, guys. And if you have questions, if you'd like to know more, just email me at sergeyross.live@gmail.com. You'll have an address here on your left. But other than that, this is pretty much it, all you have to know, and I will see you in the next episode.